Hello again, and thank you all for coming. We're going to get started. While we're doing so, I'd like to introduce our presenter today. Her name is Eunice Charles. She is born in Haiti, raised right here in Malden, and she is the owner of Naturally beauty products here in Malden. So, if you would come on up, Eunice. Thank you so much.
Hello and welcome to the Massachusetts for Kennedy Malden Community Town Hall. We wanted to first start today by saying the Pledge of Allegiance, so I'm asking you all, please join one of our fourth graders from the Shepherd School, Petra DeMarco Davila, in saying the pledge.
I pledge allegiance
of the United States of America
and to the republic
for which it stands, one nation,
and
under God,
indivisible, with liberty
and justice for all.
Thank you so much, Petra. We are so happy to have you all here today. My name is Eunice Charles, and I am here because I believe that Joe Kennedy should be the next senator from Massachusetts. So we all have a story to tell, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about my story. In the 1980s, my parents made a decision. In our native country, there was a lot of political turmoil. My parents didn't want to be in poverty, and they wanted to do what every parent wants for their children. They wanted to provide the best life for them. So my parents decided that our family was going to immigrate to America. My mom came here first, and she first looked for work, making just about minimum wage. She went to school in the evenings to learn English, and then she got her GED, and then she became a medical assistant, and in less than 10 years, my mom was able to get her citizenship and get her whole family here. So my father, my brother, my sister, and I. And 2 years after that, they were able to purchase their first home right here in Malden. I love my family's story because it's a story about grit and determination, but mostly it's a story about faith and the ideals of our melting pot. I am so proud to be from this community. I love being from Malden. This is where I went to school from grades 2 to 12. This is where I got my first job, where I go to church, where I learned about civic engagement, where I came back after college, and where I recently started a business. But my story and stories about families like yours are not attainable for a lot of people because of policies. And this is why I am supporting Joe, because I believe that he can and will work to bring about laws that will work for us, not just for some of us, but for all of us. And so when I heard that Joe was going to be doing some town halls around Massachusetts, I wanted to get involved. I wanted him to come to my community, and I wanted my community to know the Joe that I know. And this is the best place to do it. This is a place you can ask him your questions. You can learn how he feels about different policies, where he stands on it. And by knowing where he stands on these issues, you can better get to know Joe. And so let's get started. Please welcome Congressman Joe Kennedy.
I'd start with just a small town girl, but I don't think that quite works. Eunice, thank you. Well done. Give her a big round of applause, everybody. Hey guys, Thanks for coming, everybody up there. I assume if I'm out of here, you can't really see me either, huh? I'll do my best to make sure that folks can. You guys, can you hear me up there? Great, awesome. So at the very least, you can hear me. Thank you so much for coming. I am so honored to be here. I'm so excited to be here. I am grateful to have such an enormous crowd here. Thank you, guys. We have about an hour, a little over an hour about an hour and a half, right? More or less. So what I figured we could do is I will jump right into it. I'll give you a little bit about me, a bit about what's going on in this race, and then let's get to as many questions as we possibly can until we get the heave-ho on out of here. There should be somebody in the crowd right over here with a microphone who will be around making sure that people, if you raise your hand, will be able to ask a question. My only request, and I think we've gone through some of these rules already, is that a question actually ends in a question mark, right? Fair enough? 2, that I will try to get through as many questions as possible by being as short and direct as I possibly can. Please, I would ask that anybody that asks a question do the same. Fair enough? More or less? Great. So with all of that being said, thanks for coming, everybody. Grateful to have all of you here, particularly after a not so great Patriots game last night, but go Celtics. So we'll move on to the next one. Go Bruins, there we go. So a little bit about me and about why we're doing this, and then let's get into the questions. 1, we're here today because I think this is the most basic fundamental responsibility of an elected official, period, at any level. House, Senate, President, State House, State Rep, Governor, anywhere. Is that you meet people where they are, and you listen to them. You take questions. You give answers. You make sure that people, particularly at a time when they don't believe that their government is working for them or answering their concerns, you do everything you can to ensure that people know exactly where you stand, who you're fighting for, why you're fighting for them, and if you win, great, and if you lose, that you're going to get back up and keep on fighting. And that's what today is all about. It's been part of my work over the course of the past 7 or so years as a congressman from the 4th District of Massachusetts, a district that's a little bit further south and west of here. But from my first term, we did something called Tour 34. We represent 34 cities and towns throughout that district. And my pledge was to hold office hours in every single community that I represent over the course of the term. So you didn't have to come and try to track me down. That I was going to be there in your hometown, making sure that I was available and accessible. And come on by the library, the police station, the fire station, anywhere, and we could have a chat. And you would be amazed at what some people want to come and talk to their congressman about. But that's the important part of the job. And so over the course of the next month, we will do 13 more town halls across the state. We just did one out in Worcester. We are here, obviously, this afternoon. Next Saturday, I know we do one on Martha's Vineyard in the morning, and I don't know where we go after that. Somebody will... Lowell? I go from Martha's Vineyard to Lowell? Barnstable. And then Lowell. And a whole bunch of... And we'll be back at, don't worry, we got Springfield coming up too. So we'll be all over the state. We have been in the race for about 90 days so far. We have done literally well over 150 events in every corner of our Commonwealth. We have we've visited over 70 different cities and towns across our state, trying to make sure that we can bring as many people into this process as early as we can. And again, that will be the basic responsibility and my pledge to you over the course of the rest of this race. And so with that, a little bit about me. My name's Joe. Hopefully some of you knew that. I was born just down the street, actually over in Brighton. I got a twin brother named Matt. He likes to say that 8 minutes separating us, he's the older brother, were the greatest 8 minutes of his life. If any of you have twin brothers or older siblings, you would probably know that feeling. Went on off to college in California. I was actually an engineering major by training. I loved math because you could get the right answer. And I stopped liking math when I couldn't get the right answer, which sadly didn't take very long. I went from college essentially off to the Peace Corps. I was a volunteer in the Dominican Republic for about 2.5 years. And I worked, my main focus there was on 2 projects, one of which was helping a group of younger Dominican men that were getting horribly exploited by these big international tour companies. And we took advantage of a little-known law that helped, not wholly, but helped level the playing field so that they could get a fairer shake for the work that they were putting in. About a mile away was a Haitian community that was facing an even greater level of degradation and exploitation. And I worked pretty hard to make sure that some of their most basic needs were met. And candidly, I was largely unsuccessful. And I wrestled with this idea that the law could be so powerful for one community and so powerless for another one about a mile away. And I went off to law school to try to figure out why that would be. And I found out that they don't teach you that in law school either. I spent much of my time in law school as a legal aid volunteer, working predominantly on trying to keep people in their homes in the midst of a foreclosure crisis in the middle of that financial collapse. Working again predominantly in places like Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan, helping tenants, most of whom did everything right, were still paying their rent. Yet still, because of the cracks and fractures in our system, they were the ones that were being forced out and on the street, even though they didn't do anything wrong. And it was a front row seat to see that sometimes in our society, that pain comes down on those that not only can least afford to bear it, but that didn't do anything to deserve it in the first place. It was my time in the court system that got me interested in our criminal justice system. And after law school, I was a prosecutor for a couple of years in a couple of different counties across Massachusetts. First on the Cape and Islands, and then up in Middlesex County here. And as a new ADA, you are in the emergency room of the criminal justice system. Whatever comes in those doors is yours. And so for me, much like anybody else, most of those cases came down into two categories. One, drugs. And yes, the buying and selling, but more often, the degradation and exploitation that comes with addiction. What happens when people are sick and addicted, particularly to opioids? And if you can't get access to the treatment and help that you need, where the cracks in our society push folks in need of help. And second, domestic violence. And a recognition that those cases are very different, without question. But both are also a reflection of a power dynamic across our society of who has power and who doesn't. And what happens when those who need it and need a voice don't get access to the protection that they deserve. It was my time in the court system, and particularly again dealing with issues around mental behavioral illness and addiction, that got me interested in the policies that drove us to that position. Because if your goal was to take that stack of files that you saw on your desk every morning from that high to this high, you realize that you try to get people out. You don't get people in the system in the first place, but you keep them out of it. And that's what policy is supposed to be. And so I had the opportunity to run for office, and I've been representing the 4th District of Massachusetts for the past 7 years. Most of my focus has been on two main areas. One, making sure that the communities like Fall River and Taunton, that those families and those kids get the same access that you hear about in Newton and Brookline and Wellesley and Needham. That same access to opportunity to ensure that it touches everybody. And the second, for me, the most basic responsibility of government, to ensure that those most in need of help, those most in need of support, the poor, the sick, the suffering, immigrants, LGBTQ families, people suffering with mental behavioral illness, that they get the protection that they need and the hand that they need. And folks, more than anything else, that is the reason why I decided to jump into this race. Because at no time in modern American history have we had a president of the United States that looks upon members of those groups and seeks to exploit, vilify, and take advantage of them every single day. And so yes, our number one responsibility has to be to push back against the hate and vitriol coming out of an Oval Office every single day. But we also have to recognize that for so many of members of our community, that their challenges began long before Donald Trump ever ran for office in the first place. That tonight, across our country, 500,000 people will go homeless. 37 million will go hungry. 37 million. There is not a single neighborhood in our country where a minimum wage worker working full-time can afford a 2-bedroom apartment. We've got the highest rates of incarceration and the highest rates of maternal mortality in the developed world. And it's worse for women of color. Half of all of the adults in our nation will not get access to the mental health treatment that they need today. I was in a hospital in my district a couple of months ago. They couldn't get the gurneys down the hallways in the emergency room because they were overflowing with patients in need of a mental health bed. There was an 83-year-old senior citizen who had been there for 5 days in an emergency room, waiting for a bed. an 8-year-old little boy waiting in an emergency room for 150 hours and counting, waiting for a bed. And I believe that we can do better. I believe that the richest, most powerful nation in the world is capable of caring for that kid. I believe in a country where success is an achievement, but the protection of basic dignity doesn't have to be. And at its core, folks, that starts with a government that shows up, that hears you, that listens to you, that says, we got your back, whoever you are. That we're gonna be there for you so that you are seen and heard and count. It's a basic promise that we made. Our founding documents, that we all are created equal. But we also know that when our founders wrote those words all those years ago, that when they wrote we, they didn't really mean we. That we referred to rich, white, Protestant men. And that was it. But our country's journey, our history, our story, is about expanding that definition of we, to ensure that eventually it does mean everybody, every one of us, no matter the God of your prayers, the color of your skin, the language of your native tongue, where you come from, the hand that you hold, whoever you are. Here, you count. And we got your back. But for the first time in an awfully long time, we got a president that is actively trying to roll back that story. That says, actually, you don't quite count as much as somebody else. That you are less worthy than your neighbor. And that's the challenge of our time. But I know, I am certain of how history will go back and look back on Donald Trump. These are the moments that we teach our kids about. Moments about Japanese internment camps and the story of the St. Louis, where we rejected Holocaust refugees from coming to our shores because our country was full. I know how he will be judged. The part that is unwritten is what is said about the rest of us, and whether we did all that we could to reclaim the power, potential, the narrative of our nation. That's what's on the ballot in November. Whether we are, in fact, the country we believe we can be and the people that we know we are. And for that fight, I am all in. And I'm so glad that you guys are here too. We are gonna have a blast over the course of the next year. My pledge to you, I will knock on more doors and shake more hands and have more meats on a stick and go to more Dunkin' Donuts than you could possibly imagine. And I cannot tell you, there are a lot of Dunkin' Donuts across Massachusetts. Turns out. And we're gonna have a blast while doing it. I'm so grateful that you guys are here. Let's take some questions. Thanks, everybody.
My name is Michael O'Brien. I live in Winchester, and I came to your town hall to ask a couple of questions. First one is, when is someone going to stand up to Congress, stand up to Donald Trump as a bully, and he downgrades fellow congressmen? And when is someone going to stand up to him and tell him, that's it, it's over?
So, I guess the short answer to that, sir, is we're trying. Many of us have tried to stand up to him, have done our best to stand up to him every single day. I think you've got a number of folks across Massachusetts that have done so in a particularly powerful and poignant ways. And of course, there's no greater evidence of that than the vote that we cast right before our Christmas holidays on a vote for impeachment. And let me be clear about this, because I think sometimes this gets lost. I'm not a fan of this president. I don't agree with, I think, any of his policies that I'm aware of. I don't believe that he exudes the character, demeanor, integrity that we should aspire to be in the Oval Office. I also did not run for office to impeach a president. I ran for office to try to make sure that our government was delivering for the needs of our people every single day, and I don't think we are. But if you have a president that repeatedly defies his oath of office, violates our law, and flaunts the Constitution, I don't know what else we can do. And so the vote that I cast about 3 weeks ago was one for those history books. It was one that I take no joy in casting. But from my perspective, that is a vote that our president brought on himself. And if he's going to continue to violate the law, then we are going to continue to hold him accountable every single which way we can. Now, that is on me to go out there and not only yell from the rooftops and show it and teach it and go out there and make sure that I can talk to as many folks as I can about it. But that is also what this next campaign is about. And it's about whether an electorate, whether a nation is going to allow for somebody that flaunts the law the way that he does to win re-election, or whether we as a nation stand up and say, you're done, if our Senate colleagues will not do what they need to do. And so I hope that over the course of the 11 months ahead, we make that case abundantly clear. And I appreciate the question. Thank you, sir. In the red, right behind you.
I'm gonna hold on to it. Okay. Hi, Representative. My name's Michael, live down the street on Pleasant. I just wanted, first of all, it really resonates with me, your story about working in legal aid. I myself am a legal aid worker out in Lynn. I just wanted to say, you know, I'm a little concerned because, you know, myself, a bunch of other, you know, public interest lawyers, none of us in our interactions with, you know, working class folks, you know, have seen the need for marijuana prohibition. And you talk repeatedly about how it's time for a generational change in leadership, you know, as opposed to your opponent in this Senate primary. And he had been for, you know, lessening federal restrictions on marijuana distribution and also for decriminalization for decades, whereas you only reversed your position on the criminalization of marijuana, what was it, last year? 2 years after Massachusetts decriminalized at the state level. So, you know, you talk about a change in leadership and a change in generation. How can we expect you to lead our generation when you aren't even in front of Massachusetts?
Michael, is it?
Yeah.
Great. So good question, fair question. I appreciate the chance to respond to it. One, my concern around the legal prohibition of marijuana stems from the work that I have done, and an awful lot of it, for an addiction community, and ensuring that people that struggle with mental behavioral illness, that they're going to get, one, get access to the treatment that they need, and two, as we legalize a new substance, that there are the robust protections, consumer protections, labeling, marketing restrictions around it, which, as of now, is done at a state-by-state level. I came out for the legalization of marijuana a couple years ago because the status quo clearly does not work and is not working. The federal government is not conducting the research that is necessary in order to show how the drug can actually be used safely and effectively. You've got states that are moving aggressively to legalize, like Massachusetts and dozens of others across the country. The federal prohibition, leaving it under a Controlled Substances Act, that actually prohibits the federal government from regulating it the way that the federal government does alcohol or tobacco. It doesn't work. And so I have come out and called very clearly for removing marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act, for full-on legalization, for recognizing, as I did a long time ago, the desperate impact that marijuana prohibition has had on communities of color as a racial justice issue. And that as we work through the legalization process, that desperate impact has to be addressed and then affirmatively responded to in the ways in which we look at contracts, ownership, and access to capital. All of that has to take place. But we also have to acknowledge, or at least I believe we have to acknowledge, that in the midst of an opioid epidemic that was the abuse of a controlled substance, that we put in place the proper safeguards to ensure that we don't walk into another addiction epidemic. And I'm satisfied, given the concerns that I have, the research that I have done, that those concerns can be minimized. I do think there needs to be federal regulation, consumer protections put around it. But I appreciate the question. Thank you. Yeah.
Folks, we also have a mic upstairs if you have questions there as well.
Who's next?
Good afternoon, Congressman. My name is Kevin Carthouse. I'm from Roxbury.
Hey.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you for being here. My question is about opioids, which you've touched on so far, which I appreciate. I lost my brother Jim to an opioid addiction overdose in May. So my question, obviously, and my concern hits home for me and my family. What do you plan to do to prevent this epidemic going forward? What do we plan to do with all the people that are currently suffering? And I saw that you went down to Massachusetts Avenue, and I live right there in Roxbury, so I know how dangerous and how awful the situation is down there. And number 3, what do we do about the situation that got us here in the first place, which is the insurance companies incentivizing doctors to go out and use this product and give it to addicts and make people addicts? Thank you.
Kevin? So, great question. Let me start by saying I am very, very sorry for your family's loss. I am certain there are other folks in this room this afternoon that can tell a very similar story. And I would imagine that there's an awful lot of folks here that would say that their families have been touched by this, and I think as people know, mine has as well. And it's devastating. So my heart goes out to you and your family.
Thank you.
What needs to be done about it, I think one of the challenges that comes with addiction is that it is easier than people think to fall into and an absolute nightmare to try to resolve. Such that, as again, I think others in the crowd will know that once if you are able to enter into recovery, you are in recovery for the rest of your life. And look, I was exposed to this on the criminal justice side of things, where you'd have people come in the doors that would get charged with breaking into 15 cars in a night, 4 or 5 homes in a weekend. And there were kids that were stealing spare change and back then GPSs that were mounted in your car. They get charged with 15 felonies because they were trying to sell those GPSs to satiate a 4 or 5 pill a day habit, which was $400. And you could break into those 15 cars and that might get you through a weekend. And after that weekend, you had to go out and do it again. And so what got us there, complex series of factors, the false marketing and the lies that were put forth by Purdue Pharma, 1, and then an industry around it, 2, I think played the biggest role. You are now finally seeing some legal ramifications that are being brought to bear on that company, but others as well. Because not only was there clearly false marketing for which the company pled guilty years ago for deliberately misleading the public, but when you have communities in Appalachia, small towns of say 1,000 people, that were prescribed millions of pills in a year, you can't tell me that somebody didn't know that something that shouldn't be happening was happening. And that's beyond one drug company. That's beyond one prescriber. That's a system, an indictment of a system. So 1, what do you do about it? You put in place a regulatory authority to ensure that we don't go through this again. You make sure that we close those loopholes in Congress that enabled it to happen. You shine a spotlight on the individuals or systems that created that space that allowed it to happen as well. For folks that are in the midst of suffering from addiction, you make sure that we actually treat mental and behavioral illness like we do physical illness for everybody across this country, which means you get access to it. We erode the stigma around it so that we can say, if I asked everybody in this crowd today, how many of you have a loved one that was afflicted with cancer, I am certain every hand would go up. If I asked this crowd, how many have a loved one that was afflicted with mental and behavioral illness, I doubt it. 20% of our country will wrestle with mental and behavioral illness over the course of their life. 1 in every family. yet the stigma associated with it is anything but. It's ensuring that we do hold insurance companies accountable when it comes to the treatment thereof. Mental health parity, which was a law passed by my cousin Patrick. It's been one of my biggest areas of focus, not only on the insurance side, but on expanding access to care through a comprehensive system for mental and behavioral illness. And we're working on, I've got a number of bills that do so on everything from reimbursement rates to loan forgiveness to various incentives for doctors to an overarching structure of looking at the ways in which we fall through the cracks. Last piece. I'm sorry for the long answer. I was out in Western Massachusetts recently. I was talking to the sheriff, and I asked him roughly how many people that night in his jail were suffering from mental behavioral illness or addiction. Anybody want to guess what he said, statistic, roughly? 90%. 90% of the people in jail that night were sick. 90%. We've criminalized mental and behavioral illness in this country. And we put it off to the shadows. And we say, oh, if we don't see it, it might not be there. Until it so hits you in the face as it does on Mass and Cass. And yes, I was down there a couple months ago. And the story of a young woman that came up to me in tears, and she let me have it. Tell me what else I need to do to get clean. I have done everything, and yet I still am on the street. And folks, that is in a state, our state, with 98% healthcare coverage. And our system still put her on the street. That 8-year-old little boy, he did nothing wrong. He's been in the hospital for 150 hours. We have to treat mental and behavioral health patients with the dignity that they deserve. And that's going to be a big area of focus of mine going forward. Thank you.
Reminder to folks just to speak pretty clear and loud into the mic so that everyone in the way back can hear you.
Good evening, Joe. My name is Mike Sullivan. I'm from Malden, and I'm a 38-year union carpenter. In our country, we've had the rich seem to get richer. They're represented. The poor are represented. We try to take care of them. My question to you, as you're running for Senate, is what are you going to do for the working guy, the middle class, the people that are paying for all of this? That's what I want. What's your plan for us? Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for what you do. 38 years. That's an awful lot of hammer and nails and more than anything. Thank you for helping build this city, our state, and this region. I am quite possibly the world's worst carpenter. Somebody said no. Yeah, no, I very quick aside, I was a Peace Corps volunteer, as you heard me say. I was trying to build a bunch of folks' latrines when I was in the Peace Corps. It's a big need to make sure people have a place to use the restroom, and there's a project that was put forward so that I could do that. My counterpart would, people were trying to help would dig a hole. We then would build an outhouse on top of it. I built the thing with him. I walked away that night. He, over the course of the night, took the entire thing apart and rebuilt it after I left because he was actually a carpenter. And I did such a bad job that he didn't want to tell me how bad I was at it. He just rebuilt it. So, my own slice of humble pie in a very humble way. So thank you for what you do. Look, we can go back and forth on statistics on this that prove your point over and over and over again. Wages have essentially been stagnant for more or less 40 years. Corporate profits have never been higher. We have seen a slow and steady but consistent erosion and transfer of power in this country from families and workers to corporations. And let's be clear about this. That has been both by neglect because of government's failure to act, but also by choice, by government's deliberate transfer of power from you and your family to a corporation. Look at the appointees on the Supreme Court. You'll see it there. Look at a tax cut in 2017. You'll see it there. Look at the consistent transfer of tax burden from the investments that were necessary to help build the largest and most vibrant middle class in world history, to a nation that now, at record low unemployment, is facing $1 trillion deficit. If an economy actually slows, we won't have the tools needed to actually meet it and pull us out of it. All for short-term political gain rather than the long-term investment in our country. So what do we need to do about it? One, you need to make sure that those who can afford to make this investment, that they are. And that's starting to repeal the 2017 tax cut that were put forth by Republicans literally in the dead of night. But two, to go beyond that to make sure that those that have the means to make these investments, that they do. We are in a country now where in 28 states across our nation, including this one, the cost of childcare from birth to 5 is more expensive than tuition at a public university. It is more expensive to raise a baby from birth to 5 than to send your kid to UMass. You have 18 years to save for that college tuition at UMass, you get 9 months for this one. There is an expectation today that both parents, they're gonna work. You tell me how both parents working are then gonna meet that nearly $40,000 annual cost for that child in the city of Boston. You tell me how that works when your whatever increase in wages you've seen is just gonna run out the door on a rent check because you can't afford a down payment to buy a house. You tell me the ramification that we've seen of this when the median net worth of a white family in Greater Boston is $247,000, and for an African American family it's $8 after a decade of economic growth. You tell me about the ramification of it when you've got a generation that has $1.7 trillion of student loan debt. 3 kids. 4 kids. 3 in college. God bless you. It doesn't work. I was with a family in Worcester at a town hall there who, interestingly enough, was also a carpenter. She pulled me aside, she was in tears. She pulled me aside afterwards and said, look, I make a good living, and I cannot make ends meet. And I don't know why I feel like a failure, but I cannot make ends meet in the city of Worcester because I can barely afford rent. When you have costs of services that have increased at 8 times the cost of the increase of wages, healthcare, college education, rent, children, that nest egg is gone. And so what does it take? Investment, taxes, rethinking and recalibration of the basic structures of our economy, cracking down on corporate consolidation, antitrust, cracking down on non-competes and forced arbitration clauses, actually centering the power of an American workforce with workers and families rather than ceding it to a corporation who passed the money off in stock buybacks and stock price. You know the percentage of American families that own stocks? What? Roughly 80% of stocks are controlled by, well, half of American families don't own a single stock. Roughly half. 80% of stocks are controlled by 10% of American families. So anytime you hear this thing about a stock market increase, understand that that's benefiting a very small slice of our economy. And what we gotta do is the hard work to actually put your family at the center of it. And for that, that's our job, and that's gonna be my focus. And thank you.
Hi, my name is Amanda. I'm from Malden. Curious, I got here late, so I don't know if you've covered this issue, but I'm curious, in terms of the US Senate, 2 of the biggest issues that will come up at the beginning of the next term is the filibuster, and also what we do about the Supreme Court and, more importantly, our whole federal courts, which I think hasn't gotten as much attention, but are being radically cemented in a way that will essentially block off any good idea that anyone in this room has for any kind of social change. And so I'm curious what ideas you have on, I know they're kind of 2 different issues, but they're 2 of the things that like the Senate actually has, like it's on their, front burner basically. So I'm just curious your thoughts on those 2 things.
Amanda, thank you. So a couple of things. One, you kind of get to the heart of what I would say is the not exactly so sexy but very wonky and critically important reforms that are necessary if we want to deliver on climate change, gun violence, criminal justice reform, the economic reforms necessary to elevate families like that, student loan debt, any of them. You got to actually reform the structures by which our government operates, because what we have seen is that Mitch McConnell is extremely gifted at making sure that progress goes nowhere. And that the folks that are empowered by the system that we have at the moment are going to continue to be empowered by it, and that is his job, and his focus is ensuring that none of that change takes place. So what do we need to do? One, I was the first person in this race to call to end the filibuster, because you cannot deliver on any of those promises, including any aspects of a Green New Deal, unless you end the filibuster. One. Two, with regards to the Supreme Court, I've called for Supreme Court term limits, because you have to, if we actually believe in a system where the law is going to be read as the law, and that we have faith in our judicial system where if you have a conflict or something that is up for, if you feel like you are wronged, that you are going to go and get an impartial hearing by a judge that is schooled in the facts and then apply the law, that you take political ideology out of it. You can have room for interpretation, but not ideology. And so let's take the temperature down on Supreme Court justices, let's put term limits in place. And so that you can have far more confidence that this system is not going to be as polarized, or you take away the incentive of appointing justices to the Supreme Court that are getting younger and younger. And then by extension, there was I think a very talented, very well educated new judge appointed to the federal bench who was several years younger than I am, for a lifetime appointment. The incentive being put in place by this war of attrition when it comes to judges is not experience and judicial scholarship. It is who is ideological, doesn't have a long record, so you can't be maligned during a confirmation process, and who is extremely ideological, so that we know how you are going to vote after you get there, and we will put you there for literally 40 years. And you got to take that down. I would add, I'm for abolishing the Electoral College, right? And I'm for keeping dark money out of politics and overall campaign finance reform. Those last two are also big areas of distinction with me and other candidates in this race. And I don't think you can divorce the needs for the change that you articulated if you're going to continue to allow dark money in politics to come in and flood elections. Right? It ain't gonna happen. You're not gonna get the change you need. Who else? Yeah. And then if there's somebody on this side of the room that has a question, you guys just flag them for me. If I'm missing you, I apologize. Yeah, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Robin. I live here in Malden. Thank you for coming out and meeting with us today. I admire the principles that you elucidated when you were giving us your intro, and those that seem to underlie most of your responses. You have a seat in Congress where you have demonstrated your ability to advocate for all of those issues. You are running against Ed Markey, who has served us well in terms of those principles and issues, and many, many others over 25 or more years. And so I would like you, please, to give us some concrete reasons, in addition to what you just said, and please not including age, some concrete reasons why we should consider voting for you instead of voting for Senator Markey.
Absolutely. And forgive me, remind me your name, ma'am? Robin, thank you. Robin, it's a great question and a key one. Let me be as clear as I possibly can. I respect the contribution that Senator Markey has made to our country. He's a good and decent man. This race is not about that. This race, from my perspective, is about the idea that if you believe that everything that we believe in, so much of what we believe in, is on the line, not just from a Donald Trump administration, although clearly because of that, but also because of the failed structures that I just talked about. That if you believe that we are in this moment of urgency, then you need political leadership that is going to match the urgency of that moment. And from my perspective, that comes down to 3 basic responsibilities. 1, that you are meeting your constituents where they are day in and day out consistently. Listening to them, elevating their voices, and bringing them with you down to Washington to fight for them like heck. And you win, great. You lose, fine. You come back, you talk to them again, and you keep that conversation going so that they know in their bones that there's somebody out there that is fighting for them day in and day out. 2, you elevate the people that need that help most. The poor, the sick, the suffering, the people that are getting taken advantage of and marginalized day after day after day. And 3, this seat, this state, this is not a swing state. This is not a swing seat. What comes with that, I believe, is a special level of responsibility and opportunity when so much is on the line for what it means to be a Democrat, for our Commonwealth, for our country. Then you have to be leveraging every single ounce of the platform and the power that comes with this position to help guide our nation through it. Fight for it, invest in it, build a bench, go campaign for people across this country. Go define what it means as we try to navigate our way through all of the challenges that we've heard so far. Foreign policy, domestic. Help lead a country through it. We've had senators for decades that have done that. From my uncle to John Kerry to Elizabeth Warren. And at this moment, signing on to the right bill and voting the right way, this seat gives so much more than that. This moment demands so much more than that. This opportunity requires so much more than that. And I think that is what this race, from my perspective, is all about. And I don't think the people of Massachusetts should expect or settle for anything less than somebody that is going to do everything they can day and night to leverage every ounce of opportunity that comes with a Senate seat. And in that regard, I do think I can do a better job.
Hey folks, if you're in the back and you're having trouble hearing, I urge you to just squish in a little bit towards the crowd here.
Hi, Congressman. My name's Steve. I'm from Braintree. I'm an IBW 103 member. And this kind of goes along with what my Carpenter brother was saying. It's about the working class, not so much in the Commonwealth, but in the nation. And the Democrats, I think, abysmal job of connecting working people with people who are immigrants, who are poor, the drug addicted, and all that affects all of us, obviously. That might be the only connection we really have these days between the guys who get up at 4 o'clock and go build these buildings to the people who haven't got to that point yet in this country. And I think the Democrats, and I'd like to know your opinion on this on a national level, is how do you get rid of the whole Reagan Democrat fallacy and, you know, all this talk about the white being left behind, the white working man, this and that, because if you look at the legislation that the Democrats support mostly, and especially in Massachusetts, a pretty worker-friendly state overall, I think the record's there that supports us. But the rhetoric and the opinion that comes out from, I think, Elizabeth Warren, and I've written to her about this, is, well, I don't believe she puts the worker behind the immigrant and the poor. When the focus seems like it's not on the worker is, that's where we're getting left behind stuff comes from. And I don't necessarily agree that it's true, but the sentiment's there. And if the sentiment's there, then you gotta work harder. Because I listen to it every day, the lunch trailer, and I know what's said. And I think we gotta get them guys back. And you gotta prove to them that the legislation that's being supported does support them. And these judges that are being appointed all the time are gonna kill us. And the right to work movement and all this other legislation, it's easy to bash an immigrant. And if a white guy who gets up and goes to work every day doesn't think he's getting his fair share, it's going to affect the Democratic Party. And I think that needs to be addressed. And not so much, like I said, the record, but the...
Steve, it's a great question, right? And I wish I had a short and concise answer for you. But let me say this, I think one of the challenges that we fall into, myself included, I ran for office because I believe that at its core, as you heard me say earlier, government is about trying to solve problems that affect us all, right? You do a deep dive, you try to understand how these issues affect you and this gentleman and his family and everybody else in this room, and you work to build a consensus as to what needs to be done to address it. You believe that government is the way in which we do so. So you come up with plans and ideas and policies, and when you show up in places like West Virginia or Arizona or Iowa or Wisconsin or Michigan or Pennsylvania or Florida or South Carolina or Maine or New Hampshire or any of the other dozens of places I have been, people say, here, this is how I'm going to solve the problem. I am fairly certain that me showing up to a place that I have never been to and describing to them why they are not succeeding, I might be right, and it's a pretty good way to lose a vote. It's a pretty good way to talk down to somebody. And it's a pretty good way to continue to ask the question, which I have heard dozens and dozens of times over the course of my campaigns all over this country, of why don't folks just understand that they're voting against their economic interest? If only they understood, we could convince them to vote the right way. My response to that, in many of my Democratic circles, so that's interesting. How many of you in these rooms would like to raise taxes on the wealthy? Almost every hand goes up. For some of those folks that I'm talking to, I said, that's interesting. That's against your economic interest. Yes, but I'm willing and proud to do it. Okay, well, you might be willing and proud to do it, but a second ago you were just denigrating somebody who was also willing to vote against their own economic interest because they were telling you that there is something else that they care about more than their own economic well-being. What they're telling you is that they're not going to be bought, that they also care about a way of life. They believe that that way of life, rightfully, wrongfully, is under threat. They believe that something about what they hold on to and cling to is being jeopardized. And speaking louder or more clearly into that microphone isn't going to convince them that they are wrong. I can't tell you how many conversations I have had and how many times across this country we end up in a conversation about what we need to do to address climate change. And yes, of course we need to. It's a generational challenge that I want to make sure this planet is here for my kids. And we also have to understand that when we talk about the impact of climate change on families around this country, that we recognize that the folks that helped build the industrial might that we still enjoy went in generation after generation in places like Kentucky and West Virginia to pull a rock out of the ground. And that those communities are attached to the identity of what it means to be a coal miner. It ain't all that different than fishermen in Gloucester, where generation after generation, they went out off of a cold, wet sea, putting their lives at risk. Father to son, to perhaps daughter to son, over and over and over again, to help power an entire commonwealth, region, and country. And that identity is linked to our culture and community. But that impact on our shores here isn't all that different from the impact of those mountains there. And that there's a way to recognize and validate the contribution with also saying, hey, you know what? You're not going to make every coal miner a nurse because not every coal miner wants to be one. But that it is on us then to help build the political consensus to recognize that in a $21 trillion economy, we have the resources to take care of that family, guide and assist that family and the education of their children to ensure that that family will have a stronger pathway forward as we transition off of a fossil fuel-based economy. Because we need to do that. But you don't do that by denigrating the folks that for generation after generation helped power a country. You don't do that by decoupling the dignity that people put forward every single day to try to feed their families. You don't do that by denigrating the contribution that they have made or the value that they hold to the way of life of which they were brought up. And I can tell you one thing, you're not going to convince them to vote for you just by showing up, but you're never going to convince them to vote for you if you don't. And I know that at least part of this is right, Because when we talked about, forget policy, when we talked about values in this last election in 2018, we won. Democrats won. Because from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to me, to Connor Lamb, and to Alyssa Slotkin, every single House Democrat believes that in this country you get the health care that you need when you need it. Every single Democrat in this country believes that you don't lock up kids in cages and separate them from your parents. Every single Democrat in this country believes that climate change is real and there's something we need to do about it. Every single Democrat in this country believes that corporate power has become too much and is now exposing or exploiting workers. How you deal with the policy, that might vary a little bit, but when it's on value, we won. Now you gotta translate that value to policy. And that's what this campaign's all about. But when you have people that can speak to it with the credibility that you do, from communities like you pointed out, rooted in their shared experience, this is something that resonates. This campaign is about finding which of our leaders at a national level can best do that. And we've got a little ways to go. But if we don't find a way to give voice and unite those constituencies that you just talked about, it's going to be a very long year. I think we will, and I sure hope so.
All right, Joe, I think we have time for one more question.
You got a young woman behind you in yellow.
Hi, my name is Shirley Maxim, and I'm a Malden resident and a wealthy college student.
Hi.
Yeah. So right now there's a debate about the probability of a war, and some people talk about the amount of money that the U.S. government spent on military working and all that. But also the other side of the debate speaks about why don't we spend that money into bettering the lives of poor Americans. And I do believe that a strong country deserves a good defense, a strong army, but I also do believe that we need to take care of the less fortunate. Where do you stand on that, and how do you approach this debate?
Yes, we need to have a strong national defense. Our defense budget is north of $700 billion. $700 billion. We do not need to be spending anywhere near that amount to ensure that we have adequate defense of our country, one. And remember there are ample additional pots of funding that provide the Pentagon the resources that they need should emergencies come up, one. And two, if a true emergency does, they can come to Congress and ask for more, right? But it's north of $700 billion on an annual basis to fund our Pentagon is, I think there's ample room to make significant cuts and transfer that money over to some of the areas that we talked about before. Everything from affordable childcare to mental and behavioral health to public education to student loan debt. And so that's where I come on it. Let me just say, because you started by saying there's a possibility of war. The actions authorized by President Trump 2 days ago with regards to the assassination of General Soleimani, I think it should be extremely concerning to every single American on a number of levels. One, and I say that, let me be clear, knowing full well who General Soleimani was and the fact that there's the blood of literally hundreds of American service members on his hands for the ways in which he helped empower Shia militias when we were in Iraq all those years ago. No doubt and no question. He was a bad guy. But what we've also seen in the 48 hours since that strike, you've seen an Iraqi government that has now voted to expel US forces from Iraq, which will without question move Iraq closer to Iran and empower Iran. You've seen Iran indicate that they are no longer going to abide by any of the clauses of the Iran deal, which did temper Iran's actions with regards to the pursuit of a nuclear weapon, which they've now said is off the table, which they did a couple hours ago. You have also seen, as military analysts has pointed out, that this strike has put in potential threat other military leaders and diplomatic leaders from the United States and our allies that before would have been off the table. A former member of the Pentagon pointed out that this is not a question of will this lead to war. This was akin to a U.S. declaration of war on Iran already. This came with no congressional notification, with no congressional justification. The information that has been transmitted to Congress has been classified. I have not had a chance to read it yet. We will go down to Washington early next week. I hope that there will be a briefing provided for those that have received some semblance of an intelligence briefing. The evidence put forward that there was an attack being planned by Soleimani that was imminent has been described as, quote, razor thin. And by the way, for those that say that he was planning something, General Soleimani has been an enemy of the United States for literally decades. His job was planning attacks against US assets and allies and service members. He was always doing that. That's not to justify it, but that's to say if you are going to launch a drone strike on a top general of another country in yet another country, you better have direct, actionable intelligence as to why this is being done to preserve the safety and security of American assets, allies, and interests. And heretofore, no information of that has come forward. All of that is to say, I have been one of the most vocal and outspoken critics of the current authorization of the use of military force, the way in which the United States Congress has legalized US military activities in the Middle East. I've called for the repeal of both the one that was passed after the attacks from Al-Qaeda in New York after 9/11, and for the one that was passed by Congress in the use to authorize the invasion of the Iraq War. Both of which I believe need to be repealed because they have allowed the US president, both Barack Obama and now particularly Donald Trump, and before then obviously George Bush, to run around rampantly and use US military authorities in places of this world that the vast majority of the American public has no idea about, without the proper congressional authorization, oversight, or planning put forth to our country to say exactly what the commitment of US troops is going to be, what we're asking from men and women in uniform and their families, and what success looks like, how long it's going to take. And when you do not do that, you have the ramification that we have seen with the release of these Afghanistan papers, where essentially the US military and government has been lying to our people for literally years about the success of the war in Afghanistan. Where top military officials have said that we had no idea what the mission was, the mission has changed, that we didn't know what we were doing, that we had no idea as to what the reality was on the ground. It's been an entire series put forward by the Washington Post, if some of you have missed it. And I will close with this. The front page of the newspaper today in Fayetteville, North Carolina, home of one of our largest military bases, has a picture of the member of the 82nd Airborne sleeping on his knapsack as they are set to redeploy once again to Iraq once again. We have seen this before. We know that this does not end, and yet we are doing it one more time. It's unconscionable. So there's one last question, and we'll try to end on a happier note.
Hi, I'm Stephanie. I live in Malden. I have 2 small kids, and I'm very interested about what you were saying about affordable childcare. I actually have welcomed our 3rd au pair in September, and just last month found out that now my childcare is doubled. I love our au pair, and I'm just going to try and make it work. But I'm very saddened that I think that this is eliminating the au pair program in this state. And immersing this young woman in my home in both American and Irish culture, and I'm getting so much back from her. And I want to know if you support the 2 bills that are about to come into play that would establish a reasonable room and board deduction so that I could cut some of the burden of this cost, and also the other one that's supposed to postpone this elevation in cost for us to understand how I'm supposed to apply all of these rules with a 35-year-old federal program. Thank you for being here.
And remind me your name, I'm sorry.
Stephanie.
Stephanie, great question. So let's talk about childcare first and then the recent decision second. First off, childcare is one of the best examples that I can think of, and I've got a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, of the fact that the current way in which our society empowers and enables American families to be able to meet their own economic demands by entering the workforce and provide for a family just has not kept pace with reality, period. For 28 states across this country, you might have heard me say this earlier, 28 states, the cost of childcare from birth to 5 is more expensive than the cost of tuition at the public university. 90% of brain development is done by age 5. If you are looking at the best bang for the buck that government can spend, you literally cannot get better than early childhood education. There are recent studies that have come out that have said not only is this generational, and meaning that if your child gets access to the resources that he or she needs, not only does that help your child, it helps your children's grandchildren. Yet, we don't. And essentially the child tax credits, the incentives in the federal tax code amounts to a very small percentage of the overall cost of what child care is going to be, particularly in major cities across the country, but really for anybody. Second, the system doesn't work because essentially the way that we have built up a system to try to make it work is we way underpay child care professionals, which creates an incentive for them not to keep that job or to work under the table, and it creates all of these other ramifications that just make this entire system unsustainable and unworkable. I have called for the complete overhaul of the way that our society actually addresses access to quality, affordable, accessible childcare. Senator Warren has a bill in the Senate that does so. I'm a co-author of the bill or co-sponsor of the bill in the House to try to actually make sure that there are federal incentives and federal support for it, but also create the proper incentives for public-private partnerships and state government involvement so that we can, in fact, find ways to make this work. My wife gave up her job as a healthcare policy professional and started a nonprofit working on this exact issue because we have 2 little kids, and it doesn't make any sense. And it turns out we've actually got a pretty good model for what quality, affordable, accessible childcare looks like, and it's from the US military. Because it turns out that we didn't have one in the past. There was a big scandal around quality, affordable childcare for the military. And the Pentagon realized that it was a troop deployment issue because mom and dad weren't about to go fight a war overseas if no one was looking out for the kid. And so they overhauled that system, and it's a really high quality standard based upon ability to pay, sliding scale, backed up with your taxpayer dollars. And we should be able to replicate that model for all of us. Because the demands of today's economy require that both folks work. It ain't that any longer, obviously, that dad can work and mom can sit at home, care for the kids, and essentially provide a massive economic subsidy for childcare. Because that's what that old system was. It's not the case anymore, and we need to change with it. With regards to the decision that you referenced, it was a state-based decision from Attorney General Maura Healey that did put a massive change in the structure of a federal au pair program. I haven't looked yet at the state, because of the state level reforms. I haven't looked at the bills yet. I'm happy to. We have received a number of calls into my office for folks wondering what the ramifications of that decision is going to be. And yes, it is going to drastically increase the costs of having an au pair in this country, which is a State Department program going back some 3 decades. There have been, the justification for the decision, as I'm sure you know, is that there have been examples of exploitation of individuals that are here on a specific visa that have been grossly abused. And so I think the question is, how do we make sure that that abuse does not happen, while also making sure that for families that are in the middle of this program, that while you might be able to make it work, as you said, with some significant sacrifice, there's others that can't. And we want to make sure that we find some way to ensure that all those needs are met. So thank you. It's a great and critical question that we as a Commonwealth and a country need to wrestle with. Thanks so much for coming out tonight, everybody. I am grateful that you're here. We got a heck of a year ahead. I'd love to have any of your help and support and advice and guidance and any effort that you have over the course of the 9 and 11 months ahead between the primary and the general election. And hopefully I'll see you guys soon. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name's Zoya. I'm one of the field organizers for this area. I just wanted to reiterate what Joe said. Thank you so much for coming out here. Our team is really working on organizing a